now.
Mm-hmm.
They furnish my prescriptions at a reasonable rate. I don't know if you fellows are familiar with that or not.
Okay, this is an interview at the Holiday Inn, Kingston, New York. It is the 6th of October, 2006, approximately 10 a.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, your date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Donald E. Briggs, July the 30th, 1924, at the Kingston Hospital in Kingston, New York. Home was in High Falls, New York.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
Well, I graduated from Kingston High School and in 1942 and spent one term and started the second term at Clarkson in 1943. That time I was drafted and rejected because of a heart murmur and that I wore glasses. A year later, in July of 1944, I went for the next physical and passed with flying colors. And ended up in Camp Croft, South Carolina for basic infantry training.
So you were drafted then into the Army?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, what was basic training like?
It was 16 weeks of vigorous training, and we had good chow, and I went from 168 pounds to 186 in 16 weeks of basic training. I guess I was keeping regular hours.
Now, you mentioned, might as well ask you here, you were a pretty prolific letter writer during the
Yes,
war. You kept in contact with everyone at home?
yes, and friends and a couple of girls. And my sister.
Mm-hmm. Now, how many letters did you say you had
One.
between yourself and your parents? Do you know?
Oh, I had written 37 letters to my sister over the 2 years period, and in Christmas 2004, she returned all the letters to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And probably, I would guess between 200 and 300 that my
Wow.
folks may have in a big box, which now I have, and they are to go to my daughter, my second daughter, Joanne.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, after your basic training, where did you go?
At basic training, fortunately I was home for Thanksgiving, and then went back after, I don't know, it was probably 10 days or 2 weeks, I forget just what it was. It was during deer season. I had a chance to go deer hunting. With Chet Gunterman, who later became my brother-in-law. Then I went back to Fort Meade, Maryland, and we were shipped out of Virginia, Hampton Roads, I believe it was, and we were 14 days going across in a convoy and landed in Naples, Italy, Christmas Eve of 1944. And a replacement depot on near Caserta, and it was reported to have been Count Ciano's dairy farm, who I think was a nephew of Mussolini.
Mm-hmm.
That's the story that we got. And was there for 21 days, rained 18 and snowed the other 3. And then the Battle of the Bulge had come along at that time, and fortunately we were put on a ship, a Liberty ship, and shipped across the Mediterranean to Marseille, and I can be very thankful that I didn't have to try to dig foxholes in the rocks and stones of Italy. And about the middle of January, I was assigned as a replacement rifleman to B Company, 397th Infantry Regiment in the 100th Infantry Division in France or Alsace-Lorraine. I forget the name of the town where we went through, probably Saarbrücken or somewhere in that area.
Now, had that unit been involved in the Bulge?
No, they weren't in the Bulge. They had only been put online, I believe it was in October of 1944. And they had received quite a few casualties and thing. They were under the division of General Withers Pinky Burris was the general in charge of the 100th Division. He had been with it from its founding. But I went as a rifle replacement. And the squad that I was assigned to had only 7 members, which should have been a 12-member squad. 2 of us were assigned to that squad. I think there were 5 replacements went up that day. We never had more than 8 in the squad the whole time until after the fighting was over and they started preparing for Japan, to the war in Japan. We were stationed in Stuttgart, Germany at that time, up on a hill outside of Stuttgart in a regular German caserne where they had the barracks built around the parade ground and so forth.
Now, when you went into this unit, did you have full winter gear?
No. I had an overcoat, a field jacket, wool pants, 3 or 4 pair of socks, and we didn't have any parkas, and I had only ordinary combat boots. We didn't have any shoe packs or anything. And the story was that everybody from the port had everything, and if there's anything left over, it got up to us. I think that was about the truth.
Now, what kind of weapon did you carry?
M1 rifle.
Okay. Now, you mentioned here you were a scout with your unit?
I was second scout, and of course when I first joined the outfit in Alsace-Lorraine, outside of a little town by the name of Urbach, which was abandoned at this time, and I was assigned to a foxhole with a fellow by the name of William Bilby and Chet Kearns, who had been with the outfit. They had been there about 2 weeks in this position, and we lived, the 3 of us lived in that foxhole for 38 days, and then we moved back in reserve and got ready for the push, which came about the middle of March, when they started off with the push to go on to Germany. The 100th Division had been outside the citadel of Bitchy, B-I-T-C-H-E, in Alsace-Lorraine, and that, I believe, was part of the Maginot Line. And they had a lot of big underground barracks with all kinds of trenches built and everything, and they tried to take that in the fall of '44, but were not successful, so they moved back in reserve and waiting for the spring offensive, which was about the middle of March.
Okay. What was it like to be under combat for the first time when you first encountered combat?
When we first were in this position, there were concertina wire with flares in front of us and a valley, and about 500 yards away the Germans were dug in on the opposite valley on the back, and of course we were on the back side of the hill and they were also, but when the sun came out, some of those fellows would come out to get a little sunshine and we could watch them, and there wasn't much action, and, you know, as far as that. The biggest action is at night. There were some livestock, some sheep in the field, and the sheep would get into the concertina wire, which had trip flares in it, and a few flares would go off, and we would think that there might be an attack and things, but there was never any enemy action between while we were on those, in that holding position.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were in those foxholes for 38 days, what kind of food did you have? Was it just the cold meals all the time?
K ration. Occasionally we would get a hot meal. The cooks would bring up to the platoon CP, bring in some hot meals in thermos and so forth, but that was rare. Mostly C rations, or K rations.
Now, were you ever able to shower and so on at all, or
no? When I
bathe?
When I joined, Bilby and Kearns had been in the hole for about 2 weeks, and they smelled a little bit to me. After my 38 days there, I guess we all smelled about the same. But then when we went back to reserve, we did get a chance to go back to a shower unit and dropped your dirty clothes, took your valuables with you, went through and picked up a clean, some clean uniforms, clothing on the opposite side.
Now, did you change your socks all the time because of
yes,
foot?
I always had 2 or 3 pairs of socks between my woolen undershirt and my nice wool army shirt, and changed my socks probably 2 or 3 times a day. And during the daytime would loosen up the combat boots and maybe take them off for a while, but always had them on at night, laced and ready to move in case we had to move. Because Bilby and Kearns, they kind of indoctrinated me as to what was the best procedure.
Okay. What were your officers like?
Well, we didn't see much of the officers, and the whole outfit was pretty short of officers. I don't know how many we had. Our captain was Captain John Hine, who was a graduate of West Point, a soldier in the jungle. He was wounded twice that I know of, and in fact, it was a little bit later on, I forget where we were, and I sent back as a runner to bring up some replacements, and I had, I think, 5 replacements to come up, and Captain Hine had been wounded with a shrapnel from an 88, I don't know if it was a mortar or artillery shell, and he was on a stretcher. So I came up and told me I'd 5 replacements. And he told me which squads and platoons to take them to, which I delivered them. And when I came back, he had been removed back to the hospital. And he was gone for, well, I guess it might have been 2 months. And we had another, the executive officer, Lieutenant Kirkland, was in charge. He had been the executive officer, first lieutenant. and he was in charge of Company B. And the next time I saw Captain Hine was after we had been through Heilbronn, which was we were 5 or 6 days taking the city of Heilbronn, which was on the Neckar River, and our company, I think, was the second company to go across the Neckar in a little wooden boats with the engineers furnished those, and there were prisoners on the side where we landed. Most of them were pretty young. I would say in their mid to late teens. I didn't see many older, maybe some real old German soldiers, and they were, as we would get out of the boats, they would put the prisoners in and take them back across the Neckar. They tried to get a bridge across to get some armor over, but Germans had, with the artillery or mortars, had it pretty well zeroed in, and they were not successful in getting any armor or bridge across the river. So they kept bringing the infantry over in these little wooden boats.
Now, were you under fire while you were doing
With
this?
artillery fire, yes. And then we moved on into Heilbronn, and we were kind of in a factory district, and it was pretty well abandoned. There was a core plant there where they made food and so forth, and the artillery had hit a tank of molasses or sugar, and the one street we went across, the molasses was up to the top of the curb, probably 5 or 6 inches deep. We went across the thing. It tasted pretty good though. And we went on into the factory district, and one of the buildings we went through, there was a pile of horse hoofs. I don't know how many they must, I guess they had butchered the horses for food and so forth. And then we were house to house in Heilbronn for several days. And we lost our Lieutenant Kirkland, was killed by a sniper, and a couple of other of our officers were wounded, and they sent an officer from A Company over. We thought we didn't have any commanding officer. I think the guy's name was Captain Kimball, came from A Company over to take charge of B Company, because we didn't have any officers left. And at that point they sent 2 or 3 of the sergeants back, and they got battlefield commissions. One of those was one of the sergeants from our platoon, a fellow by the name of Burroughs, who was pretty close to the general's name, but it wasn't that. He was a southern boy. And another fellow by the name of Bill English, they sent him back and made him these fellows second lieutenants. And then a couple days later they came back and were assigned to the different platoons in B Company. And we lost 2 members of our platoon were lost. A fellow by the name of young lad from down in Missouri, and another fellow from New Hampshire. I can't quite remember their names. And finally we got through Heilbronn, and started to push. And the day that we got out of Heil Brown, Captain Hine came back, had been in the hospital and recovered, and came back and was assigned to the B Company. And he commanded B Company from then on until the end of the fighting. And I think we were in a little town by the name of Almendingen when on May the 7th, when the war was declared over, either the 7th or the 8th. And I remember that we had a kind of a parade in this little town. And Captain Hine he kind of led the parade. And that was the end of the fighting. And then from then on, we were stationed in a few different towns in Germany. We were after that, they would, if we moved to a different town, they would, to the military government, when the burgomaster, they would command a couple houses and ask the people to leave so that we could build in a house. Previous to that, in most of the towns that we were in, we would usually have to dig in on the outside of the town and set up a defense around the town. And the digging wasn't too bad over there. We had our regular pack shovels, and also they had some full-size short-handled shovels and picks that would help dig some of the holes.
Now, were you ever aware of concentration camps?
No, not in any of the areas where we were.
Okay. Did you ever have any, well, you told us there was an unusual place that you stayed in a bank at one time?
At one time we were in a bank, and I think it was in Eislingen, Germany. This was the 6th of July in 1945, and they were kind of afraid that the people might run on the bank, so we were there as guards. The bank was in operation, and we billeted in the bank and kind of guarding the bank, and in there I confiscated some of the paper. It was kind of onion skin paper, and I wrote a letter home on that paper, which I have copies of it here. And my mother and Dad saved all of the letters that I wrote home, and I think they must have between 100 and 200, I would think, maybe letters that are in a box at home. One of my daughters, through the association, got some maps of the area that we traveled through, and I've been going to try to go through the letters and arrange them in chronological order and plot my trip through there. But, you know, too many other things to do, so maybe I better get our daughter Joanne together. Only trouble is she lives in Arlington, Texas.
Yeah. Do you remember where you were when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
See, that was in April
Of 45.
of 45, April 12th, was it about?
Something. Yeah.
I think, I don't remember. I could look back through my letter, the letters that my parents have saved, and probably tell where it was, but I remember it, you know, getting the news, but I don't recall just what town that was.
How did you feel when you heard about that?
Well, really let down. And,
You'd been the president most of your life.
yes, yeah. And of course, I had see, I guess I had to be 18 before I could vote. So I'm born in 24, 34. It was 1942, was the first time that I had voted. And, no, it was 1940 would be when the first time I had, well, somebody had to be 18, right?
No, I think back then it was 21 to vote.
21? See,
Yeah.
probably I hadn't even been able to vote yet. and 21, so then the next election would have been in 44, and in 44,
Would have been 20.
20, I was probably home. I don't know if I was home on leave during election time or not. I think it was a little bit later before I got home from basic training.
You said you had a brother in the Air Corps that
I
had been
had a
killed?
brother, Bill, who was 11 months younger than I, and he graduated high school in 1943 and went directly into the Air Force and had been stationed in several places at a college. He had been in, I think, Greenville, South Carolina, and he was in college station, Texas, and then he was in Fredericksfield, Oklahoma, flying B-25s, training to be an aviation cadet, and he and another pilot were piloting at night, and they crashed outside of Fredericks, Oklahoma, and both he and the fellow with him were killed in the crash on the 13th of February, 1945, and he was to graduate as a pilot about the 1st of March. I don't recall the group that he was in, and I was over in Germany, or in France at that time, and one of his classmates, John Anderson from Minot, North Dakota, came home with a body, and the funeral was held from our home in High Falls.
Were you able to come home for the funeral?
No, I was not home, and I received word. My dad wrote me a letter sometime after that the plane had crashed, and they didn't have word yet as to what had happened. They knew the plane crashed, and then a couple of days later I got another letter that my brother had been killed. And a few days after that, a message came up, and they wanted me to come back to I think it was company headquarters. So I hustled my way back there on foot, and the chaplain was there, and of course, I had no idea what he was there for. So I had the letter in my pocket from Dad, so I handed him the letter. And he explained to me what had happened, and he had read the letter, so we had a chat and a few prayers, and that was that. I think that I could have been relieved of frontline duty at that time, but I chose not to stay with it, and I did. For another, well, from the 13th of February until the war was over with on the 7th of May of 1945. And having only a few points, of course, we were in occupation with the hundreds for a while, and then we were stationed in Stuttgart and started training for the Pacific. And then Truman gave the order to drop the atom bomb, thank heavens. And that ended the conflict in Japan, or with Japan.
How did you feel when you heard about that?
Well, pretty well relieved. Because I figured that if we had to go, that I might possibly been in an invasion force in Japan, and from all the rumors, not rumors, they weren't rumors, I guess they were facts, that if that had happened, it would have been, you know, real high casualties on both sides to try to invade Japan. And then, of course, having very few points in the point system to get discharged or sent home, I was eventually transferred to the 518th MP Battalion, which was stationed up in Kassel, Germany, with a detachment in Cologne, Germany, which was in the British occupation zone. That was real good duty. There was only 20 of us there with a good lieutenant, and the company post was in Kassel, Germany, which was a good distance away. They only worked every other day on patrol, and we were stationed there to supposedly try to work on the black market for the GIs and the cigarettes, because then cigarettes were worth $100 American, and the coal fields were in Frechen, Germany, which was just outside of Cologne a while ways, and all the trucks, GI trucks, would come up to haul the coal back, and the drivers would have plenty of cigarettes to try to dispose of. And we were stationed in a house in Mungersdorf, which was about 5 miles from the center of Cologne. Cologne was pretty well kaput, except the railroad station with the Cologne Cathedral was down not far from the Rhine River. And the railroad station was maybe 5 road widths from the cathedral. The station was kaput, but the cathedral wasn't hit. And we would patrol down there with the jeep around in front of the Cologne Cathedral, which was quite a hot spot for the sale of cigarettes and so forth. There were also some 500-pound unexploded bombs lying on the curb. I hope that the detonators hadn't been taken out of them, but we didn't seem. We still drove around there on our patrols, and as I say, we lived about 5 miles out. We had taken over 3 houses that we lived in, and the Cologne Stadium was just in that area where we were stationed, and that was real good duty. We had plenty to eat, plenty to drink, and eventually they took over a local tavern and hired the owners and their daughter, man and wife and daughter, to run the tavern for us. And in the evenings we could go to the tavern. They had movies 4 nights a week, and they had a band the other 3 nights. And a beer was I guess a mark, and the hard stuff was I think 5 marks. German, and we had plenty of, I had a barracks bag full of German marks under my under my bed, so spending money was not a problem.
Did you have much contact with the German people?
Oh yes, yes. I got so I could understand German and speak German enough to get by. And while we were in German, or in Cologne, Lieutenant Catman, who was in charge of the squad there from the 518th MP Battalion, he said, Briggs, go down to the Germans had, or the British had charge of the brewery down the street. Go down and see what you can do about getting some beer for the boys. So I went down and made acquaintance with the fellows in charge at the brewery. So they said, you get a liter per week per man. So he says, how many men have you got? Well, we had 20, so I said we had 200. So he says, you gotta have authorization from your commanding officer. So Lieutenant Catman, being one of the best Joes I ever run into, he said he'd sign anything. So that meant that we would get, they were 50-liter wooden barrels. That means we'd get 4 of them a week. So I went back and took the form back, and Lieutenant Catman signed him. He says, do you need any money? I said, what for? He says, you're going to have to pay for that. Well, I says, I don't think I'll have any problem with that. I had 4 or 5 bundles of 50-mark notes, 50 in a bundle, like they bundle up the singles over here. So I went down and got with another fellow, we got the Jeep, we got the 4 barrels into the trailer and back of the Jeep. So the guy said how much, I asked him how much it was, so it wasn't.
All right, let me just stop this.
So I don't know, he said it's probably, it was 250 marks or whatever it was. So I had these 50-mark notes, bills in my pocket, so I pulled out and I give him like, I think it was double what it was. He always says, that's too much. I says, keep the change, don't worry about it. Because I had probably 8 or 10 bundles of 50-mark notes, which didn't have much use for them. So we took the beer back and we put a keg on tap. Didn't have any pumps or anything, just like an old cider barrel peg. And we set those up on the back porch, and we had some nice German beer at our convenience.
Now, how long were you in Germany?
Well, I was there until it was June, end of May or first part of June of '45, and I was with in Cologne for a long time with the British zone. That was real good duty, and we had to be on. Hi.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. For several months I was there, and then I got transferred back to the 381st MP Battalion, which was in Geislingen, Germany, and we had gone through that area on the way through with the 100th Infantry Division. And there we stayed in the hotel, the village hotel, and ate in the dining room. They had a bar there which was open when you were off duty. And you know, it was pretty good living, and that's where I was until I got word to come home. And from there I got shipped up to Bremerhaven, and got on a Victory ship, and 7 days later we landed in New York. I think it was, I got a piece here from they put in the paper what ships were due. And this was at New York, Bremerhaven, Wilson Victory was due in New York, and they put a piece in the paper as to what the ships were and who was coming back. And then I was in the, I guess in the middle of June that I finally got home.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
Yes. Yep. I had went to school under the GI Bill I had been at Clarkson for a term, started the second term before I got drafted. I came back and I worked a while, went back to high school for one term with the vets, took a couple subjects, and then in 1947 I started in Cornell in the midterm and graduated in the midterm of 1951 and studied agriculture.
Did you ever use the 5220 Club?
For a few weeks, and then then I got a job, and I maybe 4 or 5 weeks I collected on the 5220.
Okay.
And then we bought a house in Hurley and assumed the GI mortgage on the house. Bought a nice house. It had 5 bedrooms. Had been married in 1950, and Shirley was pregnant with our first child. Bought a house in Hurley, 5 bedrooms, 2 acres of ground, and a small barn and a chicken house on it for $12,500. And a second mortgage of $2,000, which we fortunately could pay off because I had saved 2 bonds a month out of the $50, $37.50. I was quite true. I didn't smoke and didn't drink, only a few beers. And then when we got overseas, we got a little bit more. And then with the combat infantry badge, we got a little bit more. And didn't have much need for cash. The cigarettes were a much better form of barter than cash. And assumed the GI mortgage on the house, which was $39 a month.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yes, I was a charter member of the Marbletown Post. In fact, my dad put me in there. Some of the older vets were trying to form a post, and Dad put me in there as a charter member of the Marbletown Post, the American Legion. And then later on, I joined the Kingston VFW, and here 8 or 10 years ago, I transferred from the Kingston Post to the Hurley VFW Post, and I'm now Junior Vice Commander of the Hurley Post and the Color Guard. In fact, this afternoon at 2:15, I have to be at the Hurley Church to be with the Color Guard, which is going to be at the City Hall for the ceremony this afternoon.
Did you ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
Yes, I did. I stayed in contact. Well, I didn't stay much in contact, but the first scout, Chet Kearns, was the one that I was in the foxhole first, and he got wounded in Heilbronn. He got shot in the butt by the sniper. And I wrote to him a few times when he was in the hospital, and then I kind of lost track of him. And here, I think it was in 1988, a letter came to the house, and our son John brought it up, and he says, "Pop," he says, "are you writing letters to yourself?" I said, "What do you mean?" Well, he said, "Here's a letter. It looks like you're printing." And there was a letter from Chet Kearns, who I hadn't heard from probably 1946, maybe 47. And he sent me a letter that through the 100th Infantry Division Association, he had found my address and sent me a letter, and so forth. So I sat down and answered it that night. He lived in Anaheim, California, and was active in the Military Order of the Purple Heart. In fact, I think he had been commander of that. So I wrote to Chet, and I said, "Chet, don't wait 40 years to answer this, or it's going to be too late." So Chet and I corresponded for several years. He was about 10 years my senior, and I finally got a letter back that he had deceased. But I had been active and gone to several of the reunions of the 100th Infantry Division. The last one was in 2004. The wife and I went to the one which was down in McLean, Virginia, which I think was the 55th reunion that they have had. But not too many of the fellows from B Company left. I think at that convention there were about six of us from B Company, and a couple of widows from some of the fellows who had been in B Company. And I had corresponded with a fellow by the name of Joe Lydon, who has since deceased, and also Bill Long, who was our acting sergeant in Heilbronn, and he's also deceased. And at the last convention, his wife was there with one of their daughters.
How do you think your time in the service has changed or had an effect on your life?
Well, I thought I always had halfway decent work ethics and so forth, but it sure was a good training and discipline and so forth. I don't think I was too much of a rogue, but they maybe didn't make you do everything that they asked you to do, but they made you wish you sure hell had done it before you got done with it.
Now, you had a couple of photographs there.
Yes.
You want to hold those up and I can zoom in on them?
Okay.
Now you carried a camera with you, you said.
I had a 126 camera, and I seemed to be able to get some film for it. And this picture was taken with it. This is one of the squads of the platoon that I was in B Company, the 396.
Now are you in that photograph?
In this one, I'm in the next photograph.
Okay.
I'm in this photograph here, and let's see, I'm down there, and my nickname was Beanie, and I acquired that nickname when I was growing up in High Falls, because whenever we went fishing or camping or just out for a good time to have a picnic or something, I always had a can of Campbell's beans, a loaf of bread, and a tablespoon.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Now you said, okay, all right, well,
I think
thank you
that was
very much
it.
for the interview.
Okay.
You said we could have those copies for our...
Yes, yes.